Welcome everyone to this Rubin Community Workshop session on star cluster science with LSST. We're going to have 6 talks today from the people listed below. Besides myself, Ivan will be watching the questions in Slack and in Zoom, although I would ask that people, I'm doing this out of order, ask that people post the questions in Slack so that people can respond to them after we've moved on. All talks in this workshop are being recorded, and there'll be a video of the session available tomorrow. And as a reminder, there's a code of conduct that hopefully you've all are aware of and read, and any discrimination is not going to be tolerated. And if you witness anything inappropriate, please report it in the way detailed in the code of conduct. Thank you. So we're going to move on to our first talk now from Nicholas. So start when you ready.
Yes, I'm ready. I'll share my screen, I guess. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'll start. And I'm Nicolas Laudieu. I'm working at the ISC in Tenerife, and today I would like to tell you a bit about the nearest clusters that we studied. Oops, sorry. With the Gaia mission data set, in particular the data release number 2. And as you probably know, I don't need to introduce Gaia in this audience. Gaia has revolutionized the solar neighborhood, but also our view of the galaxy. And the goal of our project is actually to create a 6D map of the nearest clusters from high mass stars all the way down to brown dwarfs. And to do that, what we've done is to apply the method described by Perryman and collaborators in '98. At that time, they used the Hipparcos dataset, and they applied it to the Hyades cluster. And we can do that because we have a full 6D positional and velocity information, in that case from Gaia DR2. So we have the position and the proper motion, the parallax, and also the radial velocity for some of the objects. So we are in a position to examine the membership based solely on spatial and kinematic criteria. The method, I should mention, can work with or without velocity. So the first step is to assign a preliminary membership and to determine the preliminary center of mass of the clusters, and then examine the motion and the residuals for each object before refining the membership criteria. We also added the statistical treatment of Gaia parallaxes as described by Lurie and collaborators. And then finally, when we have our list of members, we actually cross-match with large-scale surveys like TUMAS, SLOAN, WISE, and many others to have the full spectral energy distribution of these members. We applied our method, or the method, to 4 well-known clusters: the Pleiades, Alpha Persei, the Hyades, and Praesepe, whose distances and age ranges are written here on top of the images of each cluster. And as a result, we got color magnitude diagrams like the one shown on this slide. Now, on the left-hand side, you have a Gaia-based only color magnitude diagram with, on the x-axis, the G-R color, and on the y-axis, the absolute G-band magnitude. And on the right-hand side, you have the G-K color, K coming from TUMAS mainly, and the absolute G-band magnitude again on the y-axis. You can see that the sequence of the cluster is very well defined. You have some objects on the top of the sequence that are most likely binaries, and we are also able to recover the white dwarf sequence. So I think you don't see my cursor, so it's a bit of pity, but it's marked on the diagram. And the color code is basically tells us about the distance from the cluster center. But we can also look at the distribution in space for these clusters. We have the galactic coordinates, X, Y, Z, where we plotted in black all the stellar members from the Hyades cluster, but we also added 10 brown dwarfs marked in red from trigonometric parallaxes from the ground that we computed, because these are not in the Gaia catalog. And overplotted are 4 circles that correspond to the core radius, a cyan circle at the center that you probably don't see because it's on top of the, or it's below all the members, then the tidal radius, and then 2 times and 3 times the tidal radius. And you can see some of the structures that appear in those diagrams that is telling us that the IRDs have suffered from some dynamical evolution and mass segregation. Just to show that in a 3D space, and I hope the video can work and you can see it properly. So this is the view in 3 dimensions where the black are again the stellar members with the size of the dot corresponding to the mass. So the larger the dot, the more massive the member is. And then also the 10 red dots, which are the brown dwarfs, and you can see many of them lie beyond the tidal radius of the cluster. So in conclusion to this work that we carried out in 2019 is that we've got an updated census of members from Gaia DR2, updated distances, radii, mean positions and velocities for 4 well-known clusters. And we constructed the first 3D maps of the IRDs, Praesepe, Pleiades, and Alpha Persei. We have several hundred members in each cluster, in addition to the 10 IRDs brown dwarfs that I mentioned, for which we got distances from the ground. And we also see that the IRDs and Praesepe clusters suffered mass segregation, and we observed some tidal tail structures in 3 of the clusters, except Alpha Persei, that might tell us that these structures appear after 100 million years of age. So now the next step that we are currently doing as an extension to this work is to use the latest Gaia EDR3 release to all the clusters within 500 parsecs and younger than 1 giga-year. And we want to revise the membership, the distances, proper-motion ages, and also look in more details in the tidal tails and the luminosity functions. This is something currently funded by the Canadian government with a dedicated postdoc, Marusha Sershal, and you can look at that because very soon, hopefully within the next year, we will have hopefully a dedicated website with all the members and all the details of this work that people can access in the future to do any follow-up that they may be interested in. And then coming up to the future and the LSST, basically I wanted to highlight here a color magnitude diagram on the right-hand side, which is showing the pan-stars magnitude. You have on the x-axis the Z minus Y color, and on the y-axis the Z band magnitude. In black, I plotted all the IRDs members extracted from our study of Gaia. In orange, you have the saturation region from pan-stars. So you can see that there are a lot of spread in the photometry, and this is basically all the objects to the right. They have a bad photometry because of saturation. But then there is a significant overlap between pan-stars, Gaia, and LSST of about 2 magnitudes. That will be very important because LSST with repeated observations of the entire sky will provide parallaxes. And so we can match the LSST parallaxes to the Gaia ones in addition to the photometry. And from looking at the models, the prediction is that in the case of the IRDs, we will be able to look at the entire substellar regime all the way down to the deuterium burning limit at 13 Jupiter masses. And this is only taking into account the single epoch from LSST. In the worst case, in the case of clusters with 1 giga-year of age and at 500 parsecs, we will actually reach the stellar-substellar boundary at about 70 Jupiter masses. But again, this is for a single epoch. If we combine the 10 years of LSST, we will go well beyond that, and we will be able to study the dynamical evolution of brown dwarfs versus low mass stars in a large number of clusters. And that's what we are really looking forward. So I think I'll stop here, and thank you for your attention. I'll take any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You were exactly to time.
Oh, perfect.
So far, we don't have any questions on Slack. But in the meantime, perhaps you can help me with this. So you focus on 5 clusters. So I wonder if this is limited by the by how good you can select stars with Gaia, or are you planning to do this with a larger sample in the future?
No, it was just mainly an interest, a personal interest in those 4 clusters that I've been studying for many years. And now, as I said here in this extension to the nearby clusters that we've got a postdoc dedicated to it, we're going to apply it to all the clusters within 500 parsecs and younger than 1 giga-year. So we want to study the evolution of the clusters as a function of age and if possible, as a function of distance as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I think we should move on. Mike Rich, can you start when you're ready, please?
Yes. Did you have was my talk successfully uploaded?
I don't know. Sorry.
I
assumed that you were going to share your slides yourself.
Yeah, I'll
Sorry.
share my slides. Yes, I'll do that.
I don't see them on the web page.
Okay. So excuse me, confusion here. Okay. Everybody should see the. Sorry, it's a little slow response here. Okay, I'm going to talk about the Blanco DCAM bulge survey, and this is a survey of 200 square degrees of the southern galactic pole using the dark energy camera, this shows our field of regard. And in particular, I'm going to talk about results for globular clusters from this survey of 250 million point sources that have been fit with PSF fitting photometry, UGRI-ZY. Just a little explanation here, by the way. The yellow is the primary field. The white are 2 fields that we have in SAD dwarf spheroidal that have not yet been reduced, and the blue are disk comparison fields that we have not yet reduced. This shows Christian Johnson's data pipeline. This is available in the Johnson paper and monthly notices. This was a tremendous undertaking by Christian Johnson at Space Telescope Science Institute, one person reducing and calibrating this huge data set. Amongst other, so this shows a view of Bada's window. This is one field, one raft of CCDs from BVBS from DECAM, and here you see NGC 6522 and 6528. Here is a list of the known globular clusters that fall within our footprint. So there's a rich array of globular clusters. You look at metallicity for example, richness. There's certainly a cluster of interest for everybody. This also shows that the quality of our photometry is excellent compared to other surveys. So you may wonder why BVBS. Well, we have shallow as well as very deep imaging. We also emphasize deep imaging of the U band. And while I won't discuss it in this talk, we have metallicities for 3 million red clump stars that give us information about the metallicity distribution of the galactic bulge. As you can see, our color magnitude diagram on the left has by far the narrower giant branch. And so we get these nice de-reddened color magnitude diagrams derived over the whole bulge using the reddening prescription of Simeon et al. 2017, which is essentially a fine-grained 1 arc-minute scale reddening distribution from the VGV survey. Also, we've matched now to Gaia DVR3. We now have about 90 million stars matched. This is shows our completeness with DR2. It will be slightly better, but you see we do get down to the red clump. So that means that we can do proper motion selection in all of these globular clusters. One of the nice results here is for NGC 6656. Notice the different main sequence turnoffs for metal poor and metal rich here resolved now with these 2 isochrones. And this is data of a quality that you were getting from HST. Similarly, here we have 2 globular clusters where we apply proper motion selection. And remember, this is ground-based photometry here. We clearly comfortably get to the main sequence turnoff. We also get a complete extended vertical branch of these globular clusters. And these are just early results. One nice thing here, you can see the proper motion selection applied, and you see 5656. So you're picking up numbers based on the vector point plot on the far right here. You're picking up numbers that are quite distant from the cluster, and this allows you to do study radial population studies, which I'll get to at the very end. Another thing, a little result from the Johnson et al. 2020 paper, there has been claims for a double red horizontal branch in 65, 69. We looked very carefully at this multicolor space, and we didn't find any evidence that the horizontal branch is actually in any way double. And so this was a nice result. Another result is this cluster, FSR 1758. There had been some questions to whether this might be a new dwarf royal galaxy. It's obscured, it's fairly large. Who knows? Well, we got the color magnitude diagram, and also we're able to use the Gaia EVR2 proper motion selection. We were able to show that this looks like a regular metal core globular cluster. There are other globular clusters in the bolts like NGC 6522 and HP1 that also showed this kind of CMD morphology. So it's not that unusual. Another thing that we looked at were claims of globular clusters, and this is important to test. There have been a number of claims in the literature, including an APJ letter about Mineti 22. But when we looked very hard, and this work now has been pursued by the same group, they realized the importance of this too. But you see, we didn't see evidence for a cluster concentration in the vector point diagram, nor did we see any distinction between the area of the cluster and the field population, the bulge. Other globular clusters that were similarly claimed also did not stand up to this scrutiny. The combination, therefore, of having data of the quality of that will be offered by the Rubin Observatory, but combined with Gaia, is really going to result in a spectacular improvement. Now, here we have a paper that is just in revision, where we used the power of the U-band photometry to, just as was done with the HST UV Treasury Survey of globular clusters, we were able to separate population fractions, first and second generation star ratio as a function of cluster luminosity. We were able to select members that were within 2 effective radii and 10 effective radii of the cluster using, of course, the power of Gaia EVR3. What is really nice about this is that actually our scatter and our correlation is lower than the HST UV Treasury survey. We believe that this might be the case because we were able to select members at relatively large effective radius. We could increase the number of members, and also we had very good photometry. So the combination of all of that increases the sampling and will allow us for very populous clusters to perhaps look for the ratio of first and second generation stars as a function of radius. This is the work of Justin Cater at Indiana University. So this shows the power. This is why, for the LSST survey, we want to emphasize 2 things. Of course, adequately studying the Milky Way galaxy, and secondly, getting good photometry in the U-band. The power of the U-band to discriminate its function of metallicity has been known since the landmark paper of Egenlund and Bell and Sanded, of course, and earlier from that.
Sorry, Mike, can you wrap it up, please?
Oh, yeah. Okay, and this, yes. And here are my conclusions. So thank you very much.
Sorry for cutting you out cutting you off quite so dramatically.
Okay, So
No
we
problem.
have a couple of questions for Mike. I'm going to paraphrase the first one because it's a little bit long. It's by Jeff Carlin. It's basically how many clusters from the Miniti sample survive at the end?
None of the initial publication.
All right. And the second question, does the U minus I versus metallicity relation only work for red clump stars or RGB stars more generally?
We have at the moment applied it to the red clump stars because that is the best. The other advantage of the red clump stars is we have a distance estimate independent of Gaia, since Gaia's parallaxes don't reach past about 3 to 4 kiloparsecs. So we just apply it. It may work for red giants. We may combine it with an SEV base. There was also a question, have we uncovered new globular cluster candidates? We are working on that. I think a number of groups are working on combining Gaia plus things like BBB, and I think that there will be a number of groups reporting candidates where Tommaso Marchetti is leading that effort on our side.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right, thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we'll invite
Sorry to go
you
over time.
to reply to these questions as well in the Slack, so it's on the record for the future.
Yes, I'm just not sure how to access our Slack.
I'll post it here.
Okay.
All right, Bruno, could you get set up, please? And go ahead when ready.
Okay, can you see it? Great. Can you listen to me? Yeah. The mic is okay. So thanks for this nice organization for Star Cluster. I think it's timely for the LSST and Rubin. I'll be talking about the Magellanic Clouds Star Cluster. So we're going farther away, and the context of the Vizcacha survey and what we can do in synergy with Rubin. So broad context, the LMC and SMC has a very large stream, 200 degrees wide in the sky of gas. And this led to many observations of stars, gas, simulations. And now we know that the pair of SMC and LMC are in their first passage close to the Milky Way. And this led to many, many questions. So everything that happened past this close encounter with the Milky Way and messed up with the structure of these galaxies happened because of the interactions among the pair itself. So many questions that you can try to relate with star clusters here is related to the tidal stripping, so the structures of the galaxies traced by star clusters and the galaxy structure in the same line, and also the clusters itself, right? So star cluster formation and dissolution. Here, the Vizcacha survey, what's the context of that? So there are many surveys here on the ground looking to the Magellanic Clouds, and I highlight 2-meter size telescopes and 4-meter size telescopes going deeper and deeper in magnitudes, but they're still limited by the atmospheric turbulence, and meaning that the confusion magnitude limit, it's a problem in the crowded regions. Okay, so if you go to Gaia and the space is shallow photometry, and Hubble is not available for very large surveys, large area of sky. So the Vizcacha survey has this goal of looking specifically to the star clusters with ground layer adaptive optics with the Solar telescope and Patron, as well as the Rubin telescope, and to complement these other large surveys. Here, compare directly a case of one star cluster. On the right, you appreciate the image of this star cluster with different rings. On the center part, I showed the CMDs of Vizcacha and the SMASH survey as an example. That's a very deep survey, but for the inner regions of star clusters that are crowded, SMASH survey is not good for that because it's the crowdedness of the stars. So you have to go for 0.4, 0.5 arc second to actually resolve stars there, if not in space, of course. And here there was a proposition for a mini survey within the Rubin to actually surpass this without adaptive optics with what I call lucky nights, right? So with the statistics from Gemini, you see that 10 to 20% of the nights in the patron have seeing or image quality below 0.5 arcseconds in I band. So the proposition here is to use these lucky nights to go to the crowded regions of the SMC and LMC. So that would complement what we are doing with the Vizcacha survey here. Here's the simulation by by this proposition here, showing the crowdness, really the bar of the LMC and SMC that are still limited by the confusion limit at 20 magnitudes, which is not useful for the oldest populations of the Magellanic Clouds. But on the outskirts there, it's pretty much enough, right, to get this. And then here, directly comparison. And the points here are the star clusters from the BICA catalog on the LMC and SMC. And the black stars are the star clusters observed already by the Vizcacha survey. And you can see that we focused on the outskirts, which are the regions that mostly are affected by the tidal interactions. And in red, you see the regions proposed by these lucky nights with Rubin. So basically to complement what we are doing with the Vizcacha survey. And here, going for the questions I raised. So essentially the tidal structures are best seen on the SMC that has already a complex distribution of star clusters. So you can see on the left here, the outer star clusters are really like, I don't know, tidal shapes or branches there. Essentially on the left here towards the LMC, there are 3 branches of the Magellanic Bridge. On the right, essentially, is the counterpart of the Magellanic Bridge. On the movie, you see here a 3D distribution of the star clusters, a couple of selected star clusters, and the vectors show their movement, right, using Gaia proper motions and radial velocities combined, and the distance obtained by the Vizcacha survey. Now the Rubin would obtain also the distance and proper motions, would complement this map and have a better trace of all these structures in the SMC and also in the LMC. The cluster formation. So when you have a galaxy that's full of gas, like the SMC, and you have a close encounter with the LMC, when you have this binarity oscillation, it should trigger cluster formation, right? So for this, it's crucial that you determine ages with a very good precision. And for that, we need accurate photometry and well resolved in the star clusters, right? On the right, you see already a histogram here of star clusters ages by the BICA catalog, but this is heterogeneous. You need to have homogeneous ages and accurate to have a proper trace of a burst of star cluster formation at a given period of these, and trace this along with simulations to see if it coincides with some close interactions between SMC and LMC. Cluster dissolution, here I highlight one of our papers on the structure of star clusters with the Vizcacha, and that should be done also with the data from the Rubin. Okay, so basically comparing the truncation radius, right, this tidal radius from the King profile, where you have the density truncation of stars in a given star cluster, and the Jacobi radius, which is basically the limit where the stars are gravitationally bound to a given star cluster. So the Jacobi radius, when we have a close encounter between the SMC and LMC, the Jacobi radius shrinks, meaning that the outer stars of a star cluster may be lost. I mean, are more subject to be lost. And this would be a cluster dissolution like process by external events or external forces, okay? And just after this close encounter between the SMC and LMC, so the Jacobi radius will increase again, meaning that if we see a cluster that has a density truncation that's much smaller than the Jacobi radius right now, it means that this cluster just passed through a stressful event that may be meaning that this cluster is under dissolution now. And this is our first batch of star clusters. They're all overfilling, meaning that there may be now under stress, but we don't know. So here is where Ruben will take a huge portion of the work, looking for stellar streams of low mass stars that may be losing in the outskirts of star clusters. So for this, we need really deep and resolved photometry. So essentially, that's the few topics here. There are many more on Vizcacha. I leave you here with a take-home message and a picture here in 2013 when the Rubin telescope was not there yet. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions for Bruno. First one by Leo Girardi. How many clusters expected in the mini surveys? A few hundreds, no?
On the Rubin, I don't know, actually.
Okay.
But yeah, you can appreciate from here. So a few hundred, yeah.
All right.
So, a few thousand, maybe.
Another question by Tom Wilson. For your Vizcacha versus SMASH comparison, CMD, you resolve more sources in the dense regions. But
Yes.
Have you done any analysis on the relative fluxes of the sources in both catalogs? I.e., do you know how much extra flux is absorbed into the less spatially resolved magnitudes?
No, I have not go into this kind of detail.
All right. I don't know if we have any more time for questions.
I have a quick question. I once found two groups of globular clusters in the SMC, 6 and 8 gigayears roughly HST data. I was wondering if you have a histogram of ages for SMC globular clusters?
A histogram ages of S, you mean this one? This is
Oh,
SMC
okay,
clusters.
yeah, I went by, I was just curious if those, if the
So these are the older than 1 billion year, right?
I guess a bit of it survived, yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
If I may, which is interesting here is that clusters that are older than 1 billion years are in lower number here, relative number. So that's a coincidence that something happened there.
But if you have a higher resolution, age resolution, you see any like evidence of burstiness in the 1 to 10 billion year bin.
Yeah, that's our goal. So next chapter.
All right.
Thanks. We should move on.
Yeah.
So,
Michael, do you also have a question in the Slack by Jose Fernandez?
But I think we should move on to Marta, please. So Marta, start when ready.
Yeah. Here. Okay, you should be able to see my slides now. Playing full screen. Okay. Good night, everyone. Hi, I'm Marta Reina Campos. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at McMaster University. And tonight I want to talk about how we can trace the structure of dark matter halos using globular cluster populations, but I'm going to shift away from observations, and instead I'm going to be using the numerical simulations from the eMosaics project, in which we self-consistently describe how stellar cluster populations form and assemble alongside their host galaxies, as you can see in the movie that is playing in the background. So the goal of this talk is to show you how we can use spatial distributions of globulars to trace their host galactic environment. And I want to start by saying that there's already observational evidence that the size of the globular cluster population, which is represented here in the vertical axis, correlates with the size of the dark matter halo, as shown in the horizontal axis. And this is extremely exciting because the size of globular cluster populations is unobservable. So just by looking at how extended globular clusters are in a galaxy, we can know about what's the extent of the dark matter halo. So my aim was to try and learn more about this, but from the numerical side, from the theoretical side. So for this, I've made use of the eMosaics project, in which we use a subgrid description for stellar cluster formation and evolution within the Eagle galaxy formation model. And combining these two models allows us to describe from the large scale structure of the cosmic web, as you can see in the large inset of this figure, down to one galaxy, one node, the galaxy within this node, and the stellar cluster population that is being hosted by this galaxy. For this particular project, I've made use of the data that is coming from a periodic volume that has 34 co-moving megaparsecs on the side, and that has been run down to redshift 0 at the same mass resolution as our suite of cosmological zoomings. So have you been able to see my screen so far? Okay, good. So the first thing that we need to do is to select our globular cluster populations and select which of our simulated galaxies are good for our analysis. And what I've done is that I'm defining globular clusters as stellar clusters that are more massive than 10 to the 5 solar masses, that have a metallicity range that depends slightly on the mass of their host galaxy, and that are sitting between 1 to 15 times the stellar half-mass radii. And we've chosen this radial range because this more or less mimics what we can do with current surveys in other extragalactic systems. I found that we need of the order of 10 globulars to get a good representation of the radial profiles of globular clusters, and this leads to a sample of about 166 galaxies from this 34 megaparsec periodic volume. So using these globular cluster populations, I want to show you two results. The first one is that we can feed power law functions and the Vauquelin profiles to the number density radial profiles of globular clusters, which give us an idea of what's the slope and what's the effective radii that describe these globular cluster populations. And in this figure, I'm showing these two quantities as a function of the galaxy's stellar mass. The markers of different colors correspond to the standard CATs of globular clusters of populations based on metallicity, with red being metal rich and blue being metal poor. What we see is that more massive galaxies host globular cluster populations that are shallower and more extended, as we see in observations. And when we focus for a given galaxy mass, we also see that metal poor globulars tend to also be in shallower and more extended radial profiles. And this is exciting, or at least encouraging, because these are exactly the same trends that we see in observations. And so it gives us some assurance that the spatial distributions of objects in our numerical simulations are actually a good representation of what we have in the real universe. The second result that we've been trying to look at is that we've looked at whether there's any statistically significant correlation between these two quantities that describe the radial profile of globular clusters with quantities describing the structure of their matter halo. And what we found is that if we combine the information that is coming from the slope of the number density radial profile of globular clusters and the information coming from what's the galaxy stellar mass, we can predict fairly well what's the scale radius of their matter halos. So the dots here correspond to our simulated galaxies. They're color coded by their actual scale radius of their matter halo, and the background is just a fit. And you can see that there's fairly good agreement between the color of the dots and the color of the background fit. This is encouraging because these three parameters already exist for a fairly large sample of galaxies coming from independent studies, some of them from the SLAC survey. And when we include these galaxies in this parameter space, we see that, again, the colors, these independent measurements for the dark matter halo properties agree with our fits. So what we've seen is that just by using number count studies of globulars and their host galaxy mass, we can trace the scales of the dark matter halo. And of course, this is extremely encouraging or exciting in the age of the LSST and the Vera-Rubin Observatory. But we can go one step further, and there's something else. This is very ongoing work, but going back to this idea of how do spatial distributions of globulars trace their host galactic environment. So far, I've only been looking at radial profiles, but we saw a paper recently that sparked our curiosity. And the paper is this one by Mireia Montes and Ignacio Trujillo, in which they look at a handful of galaxy clusters, and they find that the diffuse stellar light in galaxy clusters, which is generally the intracluster light, when they look at the shape of that light component, that traces the mass distributions of galaxy clusters much better than the X-ray emission that is coming from the hot ionized gas. So we ask ourselves whether we could do a similar studies using not only the stars, but also the globular clusters in our simulated cosmological simulations from the IMOSEX project. And this is what I'm working on. Please don't tweet about it because it's extremely preliminary. But what I'm showing here is the stellar surface density on the left and the globular cluster number surface density on the right. This is for the most massive halo in our volume. And you can see that it has a very complex structure with has a central galaxy with lots of satellites. And what we want to see is whether we can identify shapes in these projected images that allow us to trace what's the dark matter surface density and on what scales we can do this. So what I've been doing is that I've been drawing isocontours on the images on the right and on the left, and I'm overplotting it on the image on the center. So when I do this, you can see the background image corresponds to the dark matter surface density of this particular halo. And then now all the lines correspond to contours. And the dark matter is shown by the blue dotted line. The globular clusters are shown by the red solid line. And as you can see, we can identify structures in the globular cluster maps that are tracing not only the dark matter, but also the total mass distribution fairly well at a range of different distances. And in particular, we're seeing that globular cluster number density distributions are following or follow the inner dark matter distribution up to about 0.4 R200. And this is really exciting because we're repeating this analysis not only for the most massive, more complex structure clusters that we have in the volume, but we're trying to extend it towards much lower galaxy masses because we're trying to see where this breaks. And this is also exciting because if we can constrain what's the actual shape of the dark matter halo at such small scales, we might be able to place some constraints on alternative dark matter models because that's where we expect to see differences. And so just concluding, I've briefly described that the radial profiles of globular cluster populations trace the structure of their host dark matter halos, but not only the radial profiles tell us about their galactic environment, we're also starting to see that the projected number density of globulars follow the inner shape of the dark matter halo. And this is very exciting in the view of the Vera C. Rubin Observatory because we will be able to pursue this type of analysis, not just from simulated clusters, but also from observations. So this is me, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think there is someone typing here, but in the meantime, can you do this trick with the surface density of globular clusters to trace the dark matter halo at any scale, or just works on cluster scales, galaxy cluster scales?
When you mean scales, you mean spatial scales or galaxy mass scales?
Spatial scales.
So this is what we want to, this is one of the things we're looking at. So the way we're drawing the contours is that we first determine radial profiles, and then we draw the contours corresponding at the density for a given radii. So one of the things that I'm doing is that I'll be changing at which radii or for which radii I'm drawing the contours. And I'm seeing that for quite small radii, they're still tracing each other. So in the image, it's a bit difficult to see because their structures become quite small. But I'm going down to like, I think it's like 1% R200, which is kind of the effective radii of the galaxy, and they're still tracing each other. I cannot go much smaller because I need to smooth the maps somewhat, because otherwise they're really noisy, and then the contours are just a bit meaningless. But it's exciting to see that it's actually kind of on the size of the galaxy that you can see differences.
Great, thanks, Marta. So we have a question here in Slack. How low is the mass of these low mass galaxies you mentioned? If very low, that globe, I don't understand. If very low, that globular clusters is limited to a few, how promising is this approach would be to map the dark matter halo?
That's a really good question, and that's actually the question we're trying to address. So this approach has been done observationally for galaxy clusters, and I'm trying to look up down to 10 to the 10 solar masses for the galaxy stellar mass, because I'm guessing that you need a certain number of globular clusters as tracers to be able to do this study. But this is precisely the type of question that I'm trying to see. like how much low can we go and when does this break?
Yeah. Do you think stacking galaxies would help?
Probably, but then you lose the information, the particular information of the shape for each of these galaxies. So you might be just kind of erasing the signal for your halo.
All right. So if please allow us, we can ask one more question, or should we move on?
I think we should probably move on. But
okay, so Marta, can you
That's
check
fine.
the Slack? There are a couple of more questions for you.
I'll do. Yeah, and yeah, thank you all.
Cheers.
All right, Ariane?
Yes. I'll be there in a second. Share my screen. Okay, is everything okay for everyone?
Go ahead when you're ready.
Yes, okay, thank you. So first I'd like to thank with Chris, Usher, and Ivan Cabrera-Ziri for organizing this session and for giving me the opportunity to talk about the synergies between Euclid and LSST. I'm giving this talk on behalf of the work package in the local universe science working group of the Euclid Consortium. And I've listed a few names in this slide of people who have contributed, highlighting the younger people. And I also like to thank the Popsicle project and the NGVS collaboration for their contribution to this presentation. So the Euclid mission is going to fly in 2022 in principle. It's a 1.2 meter telescope that will be orbiting around Lagrangian point L2. The first data release is expected in 2025. And it will operate in principle nominally for 6 years, mostly in survey mode. So the main science drive for this mission was cosmology, measurements of weak lensing of baryonic acoustic oscillations for studies of dark matter and dark energy and gravity. This, I'm not going to focus on cosmology at all, but this sets the survey properties. And so the constraints were that the survey should have a large total area, a large fraction of the sky should be covered. It should have a good spatial resolution and a stable PSF so that you can measure the shapes of galaxies for weak lensing. It should be deep, in particular in the near infrared, so you can measure redshifted galaxies. It should include some deep fields with repeated observations, so you could have a long-term calibration over the 6 years of the survey. It should be coordinated with ground-based optical surveys so that photosees will be precise. And it should include a slitless spectrograph to recognize objects and measure spectroscopic redshifts. So the plots on the right show you the coordination with ground-based surveys. The Y, J, and H bands are bands of Euclid. Euclid also has a broad Vis band, which covers typically R, I, and Z in our standard nomenclature. It's a very broad filter. And in the Northern Hemisphere, you see in the top plots that there's coordination with a number of different surveys going from Pan-STARRS to WISHES on Subaru that will provide U, G, R, I, and Z photometry for most of the Northern Hemisphere. And in the South, we have LSST, which goes deeper than most of the surveys above. See, the limits for LSST are written here. So in addition to cosmology, this mission allows for a number of other science topics that includes the search for low surface brightness structures, the search for low mass stars in the Milky Way, the study of resolved giants in the local universe, quasars, AGN, and you name it. Globular clusters are only one of those. So based on the constraints set on the previous slides, the survey mission was designed like this. The main survey is a wide survey over about 15,000 square degrees of sky that are within these blue areas that are areas of low background noise coming from the Milky Way or the ecliptic. So the favorite areas are these two patches, and this patch here in the south is the one that's going to overlap with LSST. There are also small deep surveys that are the yellow patches here, here, and there. And there's going to be a filler program for sort of dead time that will be able to observe certain points in the Milky Way, for example. The filters are shown here. You have these broad Vis filters and 3 near-infrared filters that are also very broad. The spatial resolution is very good in the visible. It's 0.15 arc seconds full width of max, which means that a 5 parsec diameter object such as a globular would have the size of the full width of a tenth of the full width of max at 55 megaparsecs, which is something you could measure if you had enough signal, which means that you would have to have an exceptionally bright globular cluster at the distance. So that's sort of relevant as well to ultra-compact galaxies. The PSF is extremely well known in the Viz. In the near-infrared, the full width of max is a bit larger and the pixel size is also a bit larger, so the spatial resolution really comes from a Viz. And then the depth is indicated here. It's in the near-infrared, it's 24.4. That's about 3 magnitudes deeper than Euclid's as a reference. In addition, the emission has a slitless spectrograph for the near-infrared, which has low resolution, but gives you a very good signal to noise out to J magnitudes of about 18, and you can get spectra out to about 20 in J. What can this do for extragalactic cluster science? Well, the main points are these first two. You will get wide field homogeneous catalogs of clusters and cluster candidates. So this allows you to study the spatial distributions of globular clusters, the numbers in relation to galaxy mass or bulge masses or colors, etc. You can search for free-floating globular clusters or clusters far away around galaxies. And you can develop strategies of spectroscopic follow-up for kinematics and chemistries. I think that an important other point is that for all these objects that you will have found, you'll get excellent quality photometry, including 3 near-infrared bands. As I said, it's 3 magnitudes deeper than Euclid's. It's similar to some deep ground-based surveys that we know for example, Virgo or Fornax or Vikings with Vista. It's going to be extremely uniform, which helps in studying relationships that might exist between the globular cluster SEDs and the local environment of those globular clusters. And that's really a bottleneck of ground-based observations that we will break there. And the precision and accuracy of the data means that you'll have reference photometry for stellar population modeling. The infrared photometry is going to help break the age methodicity degeneracy. And the SEDs as a whole can help us search for abundance anomalies in globular clusters in certain environments. So I'll come back to some of those. After that, we can, of course, look for, the Euclid is a very good machine to look for low surface brightness features around galaxies, and so you can look for clusters associated with those. You can study the relationship between globular clusters and ultra-compact dwarf galaxies or galaxy nuclei. And of course, you can try to exploit the near-infrared spectroscopy that Euclid gives you. The lesson, we know a bit about what globular clusters, extragalactic globular clusters look like from ground-based surveys and HSD, of course. My example is NGVS, the survey of the Virgo galaxy cluster. And the sensitivity of NGVS is shown here in orange on top of the green ones for Euclid and the blue ones for LSST. So you see it's not that different, which means that we already have some idea of what you can do. In particular, the limiting magnitudes in the near-infrared and in the U-band are quite similar between those two combinations. So what does this tell us about synergies between Euclid and LSST? Well, it seems that the two really go together if we want to even select globular clusters, find those objects before we measure them and study them. Indeed, the best way of finding these globular clusters, extragalactic globular clusters, is to use a combination of U, I, near-infrared, and some sort of size information. The size information and the near-infrared information is going to come from Euclid, and the U information is going to come from LSST or from other ground-based surveys. Here you see these now famous UIK diagrams that allow you to select globular clusters here, or here, or here. These are 3 versions of these. And at the bottom, you have examples of what happens when you have no K-band data, no near-infrared compared to the top, no U-band compared to the top, or no size information at all compared to the top, where the size information has been incorporated in the modified colors. So the ideal is to have all 3, and for this we need both Euclid and LSST. Okay, I'm going to skip this one with the justification for the importance of this, this legacy photometry for population synthesis studies of the future, and go to 2 little cases of interest. One is in the nearby universe. If you go to the distance of M82, for example, less than 5 megaparsecs, this is what clusters look like. An object like that would be spread over almost 100 pixels in the Euclid Viz image. So you can have a lot of morphological information. You can partly resolve the objects into stars, which means that the object is easily recognizable, in particular by machine learning algorithms. And spectral photometry is possible to these distances. So spectral photometry, we have to remember that the spectrograph on Euclid is very low resolution. But here you see examples of old and intermediate age clusters in the LMC that are real objects. And you see that even if this was smoothed to very low spectral resolution, you could still see the difference in shape between those objects. The old ones have no AGB stars or no bright carbon stars in this case, while
over time
there are features here sensitive of, to young stellar populations. Okay, I'll just show one more slide. The other point is the
over time
with low surface brightness features. That will obviously be interesting, and I leave my summary slide for you here.
Thank you.
Sorry for being late.
We have time for a quick question.
Okay, maybe we can do it over Slack.
Okay, we should probably move on to Kristen's then, please.
Thank you, sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
I'm Kristen. I am a postdoc at McGill, and I want to say that a lot of this work has actually been spearheaded by Emma Barberson and Jeff Wang, who are two undergraduates who will be applying to grad school this year. And they've done some really cool work. And the question we're asking here is, what happens when you try to use machine learning algorithms to find extragalactic globular clusters from survey data? So thankfully, I can probably skip over some of my slides because a lot of this talk was nicely set up for me by the previous speaker. Thank you. You know, we love globular clusters because they're amazing and there's so much interesting physics happening in them. And extragalactic globular clusters are awesome. There's a lot of cool science cases, including studies of ultraluminous X-ray sources. There was a fast radio burst localized to an extragalactic globular cluster, but a lot of, following up on these science cases and interesting questions hinges on us finding more. And of course, the problem is they're unresolved little blobs and finding them is a pain. So I am gonna skip over some of these slides just in the interest of time, but of course, the way we usually identify clusters from ground-based campaigns involves color cuts, color magnitude diagrams, and saying anything that falls in this space might be a cluster. Of course, you can follow them up with spectroscopy to confirm them, but that's a lot of work. And then you can also use information from Hubble, also a lot of work. And then a downside of HST is that there's not deep coverage of every galaxy, so we can't do something systematic. So the problems with identifying these things ultimately comes with contamination, where the brightest clusters look like stars and the faintest clusters can look like background galaxies. So, the question is, how can we identify these and have some measure of uncertainty on our total sample? And that's where we we're thinking, okay, what about machine learning algorithms? And what's so exciting about Rubin Observatory coming online is that we're going to have amazing photometry for a ton of galaxies, but because this is an avalanche of information, that's kind of why we're thinking, how well can we actually apply machine learning? So just as a note, from what I can tell, a lot of previous applications have used HST observations and not photometry, and so we wanted to focus on photometric surveys for this project. So the sort of experimental setup here is we are using M87 to do everything because it has so many clusters and it's so well studied. We're also trying to consider ultra-compact dwarfs as much as possible, even though there's unfortunately not that many of them, and I'll talk about that in a second. The data that we're going to use is CFHT data. So it was taken for the NGVS survey and it was on Megapipe. So, and again, the previous speaker was kind enough to show the limiting magnitude of the survey. So you have, like a good idea of what we're working with here. So it's great because there's a lot of spectroscopic globular cluster catalogs. There's a nice list of UCDs. And then we have a couple of other what I'm calling human selected clusters to compare to. So there's this paper from Oldham et al. 2016 actually went through and did color cuts on the CFHT data that we're using. So that's one check. And then the ACS VCS survey used HST and some of the information like the spatial information from HST. So we have those as sort of like double checks on the model that we're testing and training. So like I said, Emma and Jeff have actually done most of the work here. Emma has been kind enough to join us on Zoom and Slack. So if you have like specific questions, she will be excellent to answer those. And we're using a trained supervision method. So it's pretty much that we have input lists of globular clusters and ultra-compact dwarfs that are spectroscopically confirmed. We made lists of contaminants, so we got stars from Gaia, and we are looking at basically sources in 2 mass for background galaxies. And we're plugging them into 2 different models. So Emma is using neural networks and Jeff is trying a random forest algorithm. One really nice thing about this is that we are just using the UGRA Z inputs. So those are the same, inputs that we'll be getting from Rubin Observatory, which is cool. And then again, the big question here is not just how well can we optimize these models, but how different are they from human selected clusters? So I will go a little bit into just a first peek at our results. So this is Emma's confusion matrix for the neural network. So she's done both a 2-class and a 4-class model. And so this is the confusion matrix. So known objects versus predictions, and anything on the diagonal axis has been correctly identified. And the really, really nice thing that made me sigh a deep breath of relief is that when she went to go try to reselect the ACS VCS cluster candidates, her model actually correctly reclassified 95% of these as globular clusters. So it's just nice to have this outside check that the model is actually doing what it tells you to do. And then it's nice because we have some overall uncertainty on our population. Jeff has done a random forest classification. Again, they've both done 2 and 4 class models. So this one is trying to compare galaxies, stars, globular clusters, and UCDs. So you can see that we unfortunately don't do a great job telling globular clusters and UCDs apart from each other. But again, when he tested this random forest algorithm on the ACS VCS, human classified clusters, it did a really, really good job of reselecting them properly. So the next kind of questions we want to ask here is, one is, what happens if we find more lists of contaminants? Do we do a good job saying like these are garbage, or do these get misidentified as globular clusters? Is it tricking us? And then the other question that would be very interesting to follow up on is, can we do a better job of telling globular clusters apart from ultra-compact dwarfs? Because I feel like that should be a burning question in everyone's mind. So just kind of as to wrap up, because I don't really want to keep us over time. I think yes, machine learning approaches should be able to give lists of globular cluster candidates that are similar to color cuts. And it's, that makes sense because there are definitely relationships in terms of observables that globular clusters, spaces, parameter spaces they fall into. So it's nice to have something that can pick that up for us. And then as a bonus, we have a % uncertainty on the total catalog. How you choose to believe that, of course, is another can of worms, but it's something. And then at fainter magnitudes, the questions of how do you tell a globular cluster from a background galaxy is more protracted. As you again saw in the previous talk, we don't necessarily get down to the limiting magnitudes where we get into the weeds like that, but that's certainly going to be something interesting to test out in the future. But at the limiting magnitudes that we are probing, both of these methods are really, really promising for future LSST data. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. As we're over time, I don't think we should, and it's only a 15-minute break between this session and the next session. I don't think we should do questions live. Instead, can you please follow them up in the Slack? I'd like to thank all the speakers today for their wonderful talks, and also thank Ivan for helping to organize this. Thank you,
Chris,
both.
for putting all this together. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And
Bye,
thanks
everyone.
thanks to everyone for coming and listening. Thanks.
See you around.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.